In the quiet village of Willoughby, Sycamore Street hides a chilling secret. When Miss Jane Marple arrives for a visit, she finds a street too silent, haunted by the disappearance of Eliza Miller 3 years ago. Strange noises, a shadowy figure, and hidden clues, a locket, a button, a burned sketch, pull her into a web of lies. With her sharp eyes, Miss Marple uncovers love, betrayal, and a deadly truth buried in the Miller house, forcing the village to face its past. Will she break the silence before the shadows strike again? Chapter 1. The Quiet Village. Miss Jane Marple stepped off the rickety train onto the platform at Willoughby Station, her small suitcase in one hand and a knitted shawl draped over her shoulders. The air smelled of damp leaves and coal smoke, a crisp autumn bite that made her pull her shawl tighter. Willoughby was a tiny village, tucked in a valley where hills rolled like green waves frozen in time. She'd come at the invitation of her old friend, Mrs. Clara Henshaw, who had written weeks ago, her letter brimming with excitement about her new home on Sycamore Street. "It's peaceful, Jane," Clara had penned in her neat looping script. "But there's something about this place that begs for your clever eyes." Miss Marple, with her fluffy white hair and sharp gaze, didn't look like someone who solved mysteries. She seemed more like a kindly aunt who'd offer you tea and biscuits. But those who knew her, like Clara, understood that her quiet ways hid a mind as quick as a fox. She noticed things others missed, a glance that lingered too long, a word left unsaid, or a silence that spoke louder than shouts. As she stood on the platform, a porter tipped his cap and pointed her toward a narrow lane leading to the village. "Sycamore Street's just a short walk, ma'am," he said, his voice cheerful, but his eyes darting as if eager to be elsewhere. The lane wound past a crumbling stone wall covered in ivy, then opened onto Sycamore Street itself. It was a picture of English charm. 10 cottages lined up like soldiers, their thatched roofs glowing gold in the late afternoon sun. Roses climbed trellises, and neat hedges framed tiny gardens, bursting with marigolds and daisies. A tabby cat lounged on a windowsill, watching Miss Marple with lazy eyes. But what struck her most was the quiet. No children laughed, no dogs barked, no carts rattled. The street felt like a painting, beautiful but still, as if holding its breath. Clara's cottage sat third from the left, its door painted a cheery red. Before Miss Marple could knock, the door flew open, and Clara appeared, her round face flushed with delight. "Jane, you're here!" she cried, pulling her friend into a hug that smelled of lavender and fresh-baked bread. Clara was a plump woman in her 60s, with grey curls escaping her bun and eyes that sparkled with mischief. She wore a flour-dusted apron, hinting at the scones Miss Marple knew were waiting inside. Come in," Clara said, ushering her into a cosy parlour. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting shadows on walls lined with books and framed needlework. A teapot steamed on a table set with mismatched china cups, a plate of scones, and a jar of gooseberry jam. Miss Marple sank into a cushioned chair, her suitcase at her feet, and accepted a cup of tea. As she sipped, she let her eyes wander, taking in the room's details. A chipped vase filled with late-blooming asters, a photograph of Clara's late husband in a silver frame, and a window overlooking Sycamore Street, where the light was fading to a soft purple. "It's lovely here, Clara," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but curious. "So quiet. Almost too quiet, don't you think?" Clara laughed, but it was a nervous sound, like a bell rung out of tune. "Oh, that's just Willoughby. We're a sleepy bunch. Nothing much happens on Sycamore Street." She busied herself slicing a scone, her knife moving a bit too fast. Miss Marple's lips twitched into a smile. Clara was a terrible liar, always had been. Something about this street, or this village, had her friend on edge. As they ate, Clara chatted about her neighbours, painting a picture of Sycamore Street's small world. There was Dr. Felix Warren, a young doctor who lived 2 doors down in a cottage with green shutters. "He's a dear," Clara said, "always checking on folks, even those who can't pay. Handsome, too, though he doesn't seem to know it." Next was Miss Lydia Crane, an artist who kept to herself in a cottage smothered in ivy. "She paints such wild pictures, storms and shadows, not my taste," Clara added, lowering her voice as if Lydia might hear through the walls. Then there were the Hargreaves, a noisy family at the street's heart, led by Thomas Hargreaves, who owned the village brewery. "Thomas is loud as a trumpet," Clara said, "but his wife, Margaret, is quieter. Their boy, Tommy, runs errands all over." Miss Marple nodded, her fingers busy with her knitting, which she'd pulled from her bag. The click of her needles was steady, like a clock ticking. "And that house at the end?" she asked, glancing out the window toward a dark, lonely cottage. Its windows were blank, its garden choked with weeds, and its chimney cold, no smoke curling into the sky. Clara's hand stilled, her scone halfway to her mouth. "That's the Miller place," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "No one's lived there since, well, since Eliza Miller went away." She set her scone down untouched and wiped her hands on her apron. "Went away?" Miss Marple's tone was mild, but her eyes sharpened like a cat spotting a mouse. She leaned forward, her knitting resting in her lap. Clara sighed, glancing at the window as if to check no one was listening. "Eliza was a widow, lived alone. Sweet woman, always helping others, baking for the church fair, tending sick neighbours. 3 years ago, she just vanished. One day she was here, the next gone. No note, no bag packed, nothing. The police poked around, but they found no clues. Some say she ran off with a lover. Others think something awful happened. Either way, her house sits empty, and folks avoid it." Miss Marple's needles clicked again, a soft rhythm against Clara's tense words. "How strange," she murmured. "No one saw her leave. No one heard anything." "Not a peep," Clara said, shaking her head. "That's what's so odd. Sycamore Street's small. Everyone knows everyone's business. But Eliza slipped away like a ghost." The fire popped, sending a spark onto the hearth. Miss Marple's mind was already turning, piecing together the edges of a puzzle. A woman doesn't vanish without a trace, not in a place like this. There were eyes on Sycamore Street, she was sure, eyes that saw more than they told. After tea, Clara showed Miss Marple to a guest room upstairs, a snug space with a quilted bed and a window overlooking the street. As Clara bustled off to prepare supper, Miss Marple unpacked her suitcase, setting out a few books, her knitting, and a small notebook where she jotted down thoughts. She stood by the window, watching Sycamore Street settle into dusk. A man Dr. Warren, she guessed from his brisk walk and the medical bag in his hand, hurried past, tipping his hat to a woman carrying a basket. That must be Margaret Hargreaves, Miss Marple thought, noting her tight smile and quick steps. Across the street, a curtain moved in Lydia Crane's cottage, a flicker of motion, as if someone was watching. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the Miller house, its silhouette stark against the fading light. The gate creaked in the breeze, a lonely sound. She wondered about Eliza, her life, her habits, her secrets. People didn't vanish without leaving something behind, even if it was just a whisper of truth. In her years of untangling mysteries, Miss Marple had learned that villages like Willoughby held their secrets close, tucked behind polite smiles and locked doors. Supper was a simple affair. Shepherd's pie, warm and hearty, with a side of buttered carrots. Clara kept the conversation light, talking about the village fair coming up and her plans to enter her famous apple tart. But Miss Marple steered the talk back to Sycamore Street, asking about its rhythm, its people. "Does Dr. Warren live alone?" she asked, spooning up a bite of pie. "Oh, yes," Clara said. "He's a bachelor, though half the village girls sigh over him. He's kind, but private, keeps his own counsel." "And Miss Crane? She sounds solitary." Clara nodded, her fork pausing. "Lydia's odd. Talented, mind you, but she doesn't mix much. Always painting day and night. I've seen her light on at all hours." Miss Marple filed this away, her mind sketching a map of the street. Felix's kindness, Lydia's isolation, the Hargreaves' noise, and the empty Miller house, silent as a grave. After supper she offered to help with the dishes, but Clara shooed her away. "You're my guest, Jane. Go rest. Tomorrow I'll show you the village proper." Back in her room, Miss Marple sat by the window again, her knitting in her hands. The street was dark now, save for a single lamp-post casting a weak glow. She thought of St. Mary Mead, her own village, where secrets bubbled up like water from a spring. Willoughby felt different, not louder, but heavier, as if the silence itself was a weight pressing down. She jotted a note in her book. Eliza Miller. Vanished, no trace, street too quiet. Then she added, "Who watches?" As she prepared for bed, slipping into a flannel nightgown, she heard a faint sound. A creak, not from the house, but outside. She peered through the window, her eyes straining in the dark. A shadow moved near the Miller house, quick and low, like someone slipping through the gate. It was gone before she could be sure, swallowed by the night. She stood there a moment, her heart steady but her mind racing. Sycamore Street was awake, even if it pretended to sleep. She climbed into bed, pulling the quilt to her chin. Tomorrow she'd walk the street, meet its people, and listen to its silence. Clara had invited her for a holiday, but Miss Marple knew better. She wasn't here just for tea and scones. Something was wrong on Sycamore Street, and she meant to find out what. Chapter 2. Shadows of the Past. The morning sun crept over Willoughby's hills, painting Sycamore Street in soft gold. Miss Jane Marple sat at Clara Henshaw's kitchen table, her knitting needles clicking like a metronome as she sipped tea. The scent of warm toast and blackberry jam filled the air, but her mind was on the shadow she'd seen last night near the Miller house. It had been quick, almost ghostly, slipping through the gate of the empty cottage. She hadn't mentioned it to Clara yet, not wanting to alarm her friend, but her curiosity buzzed like a bee in a jar. Clara bustled about, her apron dusted with flour, as she prepared a tray of muffins for the village fair. "You'll love Willoughby today, Jane," she said, her voice bright but a touch too eager, as if trying to outshine yesterday's talk of Eliza Miller. "The market's on, and everyone's out. You'll meet the whole street, I wager." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes crinkling. "I look forward to it, Clara. A village market always tells you something about its people." She set her knitting aside, a half-finished scarf in soft blue wool, and smoothed her skirt. Her mind was already mapping Sycamore Street. Dr. de Sir Felix, Warren's green-shuttered cottage, Miss Lydia Crane's ivy-covered hideaway, the noisy Hargreaves family, and the dark, silent Miller house at the end. Each held a piece of the puzzle, she was sure, and Eliza's vanishing was the heart of it. After breakfast, Miss Marple tucked her notebook into her handbag, pulled on her shawl, and followed Clara out the door. Sycamore Street was waking up, though its quiet still clung like morning mist. A milkman rattled past, his bottles clinking, and a girl skipped by with a basket of apples, her braid bouncing. Clara led the way to the village square, a short walk past stone walls and hedgerows. The market was a lively patch of colour, stalls draped in red and yellow cloth, piled with pumpkins, jams, and knitted mittens. Voices hummed, laughter rose, but Miss Marple noticed Sycamore Street's residents kept their distance from one another, their smiles polite but guarded. At a stall selling honey, Clara introduced Miss Marple to Mrs. Dobbs, the postmistress, a stout woman with a sharp nose and eyes that missed nothing. "Pleased to meet you," Mrs. Dobbs said, her voice loud enough to carry over the market's chatter. "Clara says you're from St. Mary Mead. Must be nice to visit our little Willoughby." "It's charming," Miss Marple replied, her tone warm but her gaze steady. "Clara tells me you knew Eliza Miller. Such a strange story, her disappearing like that." Mrs. Dobbs's smile faltered, her hands pausing over a jar of clover honey. "Oh, Eliza! Yes, a sad business. Lovely woman, always mailing letters at my counter. Every Tuesday, like clockwork, she'd send one to a postbox in London. Never said who they were for, mind you." She leaned closer, her voice dropping. Then poof, she was gone. Letters stopped, and so did she. Miss Marple's fingers tightened on her handbag. "A postbox in London? That's curious. No name, no address?" "Not a hint," Mrs. Dobbs said, shaking her head. "I asked once, but Eliza just smiled and changed the subject. She was private, you know, but kind. Always left a penny for the children's sweet jar." Miss Marple nodded, her mind filing away the detail. Letters to a nameless postbox suggested a secret. Perhaps a friend or lover Eliza didn't want the village to know about. She thanked Mrs. Dobbs and moved on, her eyes scanning the crowd. Near a stall of fresh bread, she spotted Dr. Felix Warren, his dark hair catching the sun as he chatted with a farmer. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 30, with a warm smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. When he saw Clara, he waved and strode over. "Mrs. Henshaw, good to see you," he said, then turned to Miss Marple. "You must be Miss Marple. Clara's told me about you. Welcome to Willoughby." "Thank you, Doctor," Miss Marple said, noting his firm handshake and the faint worry line on his brow. "Clara says you're the heart of Sycamore Street, looking after everyone. Felix laughed, but it was a quick, nervous sound. "I try. Folks here are good, but they keep to themselves." His gaze flicked toward the edge of the square, where the road led back to Sycamore Street. Some more than others. Miss Marple followed his glance, her thoughts on the Miller house. I heard about Eliza Miller," she said gently. "You must have known her, being her doctor." Felix's smile faded, his fingers tightening on his medical bag. "Yes, I did. She was a patient. Healthy, mostly, but quiet. It was a shock when she vanished." He hesitated, then added, "I wish I'd known more. Maybe I could have helped." Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes soft but probing. "Sometimes people hide their troubles, even from kind doctors." Felix nodded, but his jaw tightened, and he excused himself, saying he had a patient to visit. As Clara led her to another stall, Miss Marple's thoughts churned. Felix knew something, she was certain, something he wasn't saying. His unease was like a loose thread in a sweater, begging to be pulled. They stopped at a stall selling knitted scarves, where a lanky boy was unloading a crate of apples. "That's Tommy Hargreaves," Clara whispered, "Thomas and Margaret's son. A good lad, but shy." Tommy looked up, his freckled face flushing as Clara introduced him. "Hello, Miss Marple," he mumbled, his eyes darting to the ground. He was tall for 17, with floppy brown hair and hands that fidgeted with the crate's edge. "Pleased to meet you, Tommy," Miss Marple said, her voice warm. "You must know Sycamore Street well, running errands for your family." Tommy shrugged, his cheeks redder. "I guess it's quiet, mostly." He glanced toward the Miller house, far down the road, and his voice dropped. "Except sometimes I hear things." Miss Marple leaned closer, her tone gentle. "Things? Like what, dear?" Tommy hesitated, his eyes flicking to Clara, then back to Miss Marple. "Noises. At night, from the Miller place. Thumps, like someone's moving stuff. I told Dad, but he says it's just rats." He swallowed, his voice barely a whisper. "Don't feel like rats to me." Clara laughed, patting his shoulder. "Oh, Tommy, you and your imagination. That house has been empty for years." But Miss Marple saw the boy's hands tremble, and her mind noted the detail. Thumps in an empty house, the same place she'd seen a shadow last night. They moved on, but Miss Marple's thoughts stayed with Tommy's words. The market was bustling now, with villagers bartering for eggs and chatting about the weather. But she felt the undercurrent of Sycamore Street's silence, like a river running beneath the noise. She bought a small jar of jam from a cheerful woman, then steered Clara toward a bench under an oak tree, away from the crowd. "Clara," she said, settling onto the bench, "tell me more about Eliza. What was she like? Did she have friends, visitors?" Clara sighed, her fingers twisting a handkerchief. "Eliza was gentle, always helping, mending clothes for widows, baking for the church. She didn't have many close friends, though. Kept to herself, mostly. No family, either, after her husband died. I'd see her in her garden, humming to herself. But she never stayed long at gatherings. Always seemed like she was waiting for something. Waiting!" Miss Marple's needles clicked, though she hadn't picked up her knitting. Her hands moved as if by habit, her mind elsewhere. For someone, perhaps. Clara frowned, thinking, maybe. There was a man once, a year or so before she vanished. I saw him at her gate, tall, with a city coat, not from Willoughby. She looked happy but nervous. I asked her about him, but she just smiled and said he was an old friend. Never saw him again." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, her mind sketching a picture. Eliza, private but kind, sending letters to London, meeting a stranger at her gate. The pieces didn't fit yet, but they were starting to form a shape. She patted Clara's hand. "You've a good memory, Clara." "That helps." They returned to the market, where Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught another figure. Miss Lydia, Crane slipping between stalls like a shadow. Her dark coat and scarf made her blend into the crowd, but her quick, darting movements stood out. She carried a small sketchbook, her pencil moving fast over the page as she glanced at the villagers. When her eyes met Miss Marple's, she froze, then turned away, hurrying toward a side street. "Odd, isn't she?" Clara said, following Miss Marple's gaze. "Lydia's always drawing, but she doesn't show her work to anyone. Keeps it locked up in that cottage of hers." Miss Marple nodded, her mind on Lydia's sketchbook. An artist saw things others missed. Details, expressions, secrets. She made a mental note to visit Lydia soon, to see what those drawings might reveal. As they walked back to Sycamore Street, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the cottages. Miss Marple paused by the Miller house, its windows dark and its garden wild with nettles. The gate creaked, just as it had last night, and she felt a chill that wasn't from the autumn air. "Clara," she said, her voice soft, "do people ever go inside to check on it?" Clara shook her head, her face pale. "No one dares. The estate agent, Mr. Potts, has the key, but he says it's bad luck. Folks think it's haunted, Jane. Silly, I know, but after Eliza, not silly at all," Miss Marple said, her tone kind but firm. "Places hold memories, Clara. Sometimes they hold answers, too." She made another mental note. Get that key from Mr. Potts. Back at Clara's cottage, they sat for tea, but Miss Marple's mind was elsewhere. She jotted in her notebook, "Eliza's letters. London postbox, no name. Stranger at her gate. Tommy's thumps. Lydia's sketch is bearable." She sipped her tea, her thoughts weaving a web. Eliza's disappearance wasn't just a puzzle. It was a wound in Sycamore Street, still raw after 3 years. The shadow she'd seen, the noises Tommy heard, the secrets in Felix's eyes and Lydia's sketches, all pointed to something hidden, something the street didn't want to tell. As Clara chattered about the fair, Miss Marple's needles clicked, her mind turning. She'd come to Willoughby for a holiday, but Sycamore Street had other plans. The silence here wasn't peaceful, it was watchful, waiting, and Miss Jane Marple was listening. Chapter 3. Whispers in the Garden. The morning air on Sycamore Street was crisp, carrying the scent of dew and freshly cut grass. Miss Jane Marple stood at Clara Henshaw's front door, her shawl snug around her shoulders, her handbag tucked under her arm. Her knitting lay inside, but her mind was busy, threading together the clues from yesterday. Eliza Miller's mysterious letters to a London postbox, Tommy Hargreaves' talk of thumps in the empty Miller house, the stranger Clara had seen at Eliza's gate, and Miss Lydia Crane's quick, secretive glances at the market. The shadow Miss Marple had spotted near the Miller house 2 nights ago lingered in her thoughts, like a smudge on a clean window. Today, she decided, she'd start pulling at the loose threads of Sycamore Street. Clara was in the kitchen, humming as she packed a basket with jam and muffins for a neighbour. "Jane, you're up early," she called, her voice cheerful but tinged with the same nervous edge Miss Marple had noticed before. "Fancy a walk to the church. I've got to drop these off for the vicar's tea." "A walk sounds perfect," Miss Marple replied, her smile soft but her eyes sharp. She wanted to see more of Willoughby, to feel its pulse and hear its whispers. A church, she knew, was a place where secrets often hid behind hymns and polished pews. The path to the church wound past Sycamore Street's cottages, their windows glinting in the morning sun. Miss Marple noted each one. Dr. Felix Warren's green shutters were open, a sign he was awake. Lydia Crane's cottage was still, her curtains drawn tight. The Hargreaves' home buzzed with noise, a shout from Thomas Hargreaves carrying through an open door. The Miller house loomed at the street's end, its gate shut, its garden a tangle of thorns and weeds. Miss Marple paused, her gaze lingering on the dark windows. "Clara," she said, "has anyone tended that garden since Eliza left?" Clara shook her head, clutching her basket. "Not a soul. It's gone wild. Mr. Potts, the estate agent, says it's not worth the bother until someone buys the place." Her voice dropped as if the house might hear. "Gives me the shivers, Jane." Miss Marple nodded, her mind noting the garden's neglect. A wild garden could hide more than weeds. Footprints, perhaps, or signs of that shadow she'd seen. She made a mental note to look closer later. The church, St. Anne's, was a small stone building with a lopsided steeple, surrounded by a graveyard where moss-covered stones leaned like old friends. Inside, the air was cool, smelling of wax and old books. The vicar, Mr. Timothy Gray, greeted them with a warm smile, his glasses slipping down his nose. He was a thin man, nearing 60, with a voice as gentle as his handshake. "Mrs. Henshaw, Miss Marple, what a treat," he said, accepting Clara's basket. "Come for tea? I've just put the kettle on." They sat in the vicar's study, a cosy room cluttered with books and papers. As Clara chatted about the village fair, Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes wandering over the room. A notice board caught her attention, pinned with faded photographs and church announcements. One photo showed a group of villagers at a fair, 3 years ago, smiling under a banner. In the corner, a woman with soft brown hair stood alone, her face half-turned. Miss Marple's heart quickened. "Is that Eliza Miller?" she asked, pointing. Mr. Gray peered at the photo, his smile fading. "Yes, that's her. Taken just before. Well, you know." He cleared his throat, pushing his glasses up. "Poor Eliza. She was a pillar here, always helping with the choir, organising the flower rota. Her disappearance shook us all." "Did she ever talk about her life?" Miss Marple asked, her tone gentle, like a friend asking after a neighbour. "Friends, perhaps, or plans to leave?" Mr. Gray frowned, stirring his tea. "Not much. Eliza was kind but kept her own counsel. She'd mention her garden, her baking, but nothing personal, though." He hesitated, his spoon clinking against the cup. "She did ask me once about forgiveness. Said she'd made a mistake, trusted someone she shouldn't have. I thought she meant a friend, but she wouldn't say more." Miss Marple's fingers itched for her knitting. a habit when her mind was turning. Forgiveness, a mistake, a stranger at her gate. The pieces were piling up, but the picture was still blurry. She thanked Mr. Gray, and as they left the church, she glanced back at the graveyard, wondering if Eliza's story was buried there, waiting to be dug up. Back on Sycamore Street, Clara had errands to run, so Miss Marple decided to explore alone. She strolled slowly, her sensible shoes clicking on the cobblestones, her eyes taking in every detail. At Dr. Warren's cottage, a patient, a frail woman with a cane, was leaving, her face bright with gratitude. Felix stood at the door, waving, but his smile dropped when he saw Miss Marple. "Good morning," he called, his voice polite but strained. "Enjoying the street?" "Very much," Miss Marple said, pausing by his gate. "It's so peaceful, almost too peaceful, don't you think?" She watched his face, noting the way his jaw tightened just for a moment. "Quiet suits us," he said, but his eyes flicked toward the Miller house. "Keeps things simple." He excused himself, claiming a house call, and hurried off, his bag swinging. Miss Marple continued her walk, stopping at Lydia Crane's cottage. The ivy clung to the walls like a secret, and the windows were dark, but a faint sound, brushstrokes perhaps, came from inside. She knocked, her knuckles soft but firm. The door opened a crack, and Lydia's sharp eyes peered out, her dark hair pulled back in a messy bun. "Yes?" she said, her voice clipped. "Miss Crane, I'm Jane Marple, Clara's friend," Miss Marple said, her smile warm. "I hear you're an artist. I'd love to see your work if you don't mind a visitor." Lydia hesitated, her hand gripping the door. "I don't show my paintings," she said, but her tone softened under Miss Marple's gentle gaze. "They're private, not finished." She opened the door wider, though, and Miss Marple stepped inside. The cottage was a maze of canvases, some leaning against walls, others stacked on tables. The air smelled of paint and turpentine, and the light was dim, filtered through heavy curtains. Miss Marple's eyes roamed, catching glimpses of stormy skies, twisted trees, and shadowy figures. One painting, half covered by a cloth, drew her attention. A woman with brown hair, her face blurred, standing in a garden that looked eerily like the Miller houses. "That's striking," Miss Marple said, pointing. "Is it someone you know?" Lydia's hand twitched, pulling the cloth over the painting. "Just a sketch," she said quickly. "Imagination, nothing more." But her cheeks flushed, and her eyes darted to a corner where a locked trunk sat, its brass gleaming. Miss Marple didn't press, but her mind noted the painting, the trunk, and Lydia's unease. "You have a gift," she said kindly. "Thank you for letting me peek." As she left, she glanced back, seeing Lydia lock the door with a quick, nervous turn of the key. The afternoon sun was high now, and Miss Marple decided to visit the Hargreaves' home, hoping to catch Tommy. The cottage was loud with activity, Thomas Hargreaves' booming laugh, the clatter of dishes, and a radio playing a jaunty tune. Margaret Hargreaves answered the door, her face tired but polite. She was a thin woman, her blonde hair streaked with grey, her hands red from washing. "Miss Marple, come in," she said, wiping her hands on a towel. "Clara mentioned you'd be visiting." The parlour was cosy but cluttered, with toys scattered and a half-eaten loaf of bread on the table. Thomas, A burly man with a red face stood by the fireplace, polishing a brass tankard. "Welcome to the madhouse," he said, grinning. "Care for a cuppa?" Miss Marple declined, settling into a chair. "I met your son Tommy yesterday," she said. "Such a helpful boy. He mentioned hearing noises at the Miller house. Odd, isn't it, for an empty place?" Thomas's grin faded, his hand pausing on the tankard. "Boy's got a wild imagination," he said, his voice gruff. "Rats, probably. Old houses creak." But Margaret's hands twisted the towel, and Miss Marple saw a glance pass between them, quick and sharp. "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her tone light. "Though it's strange, a house staying so quiet otherwise." She watched their faces, noting Margaret's pale cheeks and Thomas's sudden interest in his tankard. Tommy burst in then, carrying a sack of potatoes, his face flushed from the market. "Miss Marple," he said, then froze, seeing his parents' expressions. I got to put these in the kitchen." He hurried off, but Miss Marple caught his eye, and he gave a tiny nod, as if to say he'd talk later. As she left the Hargreaves' cottage, Miss Marple's thoughts swirled. The painting in Lydia's cottage, the vicar's mention of Eliza's mistake, Tommy's noises and Felix's guarded look, all pointed to a secret Sycamore Street was keeping. She decided to visit the estate agent Mr. Potts to ask about the Miller house key. His office was a small shop near the square, its window cluttered with signs for cottages and farms. Mr. Potts was a wiry man with a twitchy moustache, his desk piled with papers. "Miss Marple," he said, shaking her hand. "Heard you're staying with Clara, looking to buy in Willoughby." "Oh, no," Miss Marple said, chuckling. "Just curious about the Miller house. Clara says it's empty. Might I see it? I'm fond of old houses." Mr. Potts's smile stiffened. "That place, not much to see. Dusty, falling apart. Some say it's bad luck." He rummaged in a drawer, pulling out a rusty key. "But if you insist, I'll let you borrow this. Just be careful." His voice held a warning, but he handed over the key. Miss Marple tucked it into her handbag, her heart quickening. The key felt heavy, like it carried the weight of Eliza's story. As she walked back to Sycamore Street, the sun dipped behind, a cloud casting the Miller house in shadow. She paused at its gate, her fingers brushing the cold iron. The garden was a jungle, but she noticed something new. A patch of earth near the gate looked disturbed, the soil darker, as if recently turned. Footprints, faint but fresh, led toward the house. Her eyes narrowed. The shadow she'd seen, Tommy's thumps, the disturbed earth. Someone was visiting this house, and not just rats. She didn't enter yet, knowing Clara would worry if she was late for supper. But as she walked back to Clara's cottage, her mind was alive, piecing together the clues. Eliza's mistake, her letters, her stranger. Sycamore Street was hiding something, and Miss Marple meant to find it. At supper, Clara served roast chicken, her chatter filling the cosy kitchen. But Miss Marple's thoughts were on the key in her bag, the footprints in the garden, and the faces of Sycamore Street's residents, each holding a piece of the truth. She jotted in her notebook, Eliza's mistake, trusted wrong person, footprints at Miller House, Lydia's painting, Tommy's fear. The silence of Sycamore Street was growing louder, and Miss Marple was listening. Chapter 4. The Hidden Corner. The morning light spilled over Sycamore Street, turning the dew on the cottage gardens into tiny diamonds. Miss Jane Marple sat by Clara Henshaw's parlour window, her knitting needles clicking softly as she sipped tea. The rusty key to the Miller house, borrowed from Mr. Potts yesterday, lay heavy in her handbag, a silent promise of answers. Her mind buzzed with the clues she'd gathered. Eliza Miller's vanished letters to a London postbox, Tommy Hargreaves' whispered thumps in the empty house, the stranger at Eliza's gate, the disturbed earth by the Miller gate, and Lydia, Crane's half-hidden painting of a woman who looked like Eliza. The shadow Miss Marple had seen flickering near the house 3 nights ago felt closer now, like a thread she could almost grasp. Today she decided she'd tug at that thread, starting with the Miller house itself. Clara bustled in, her cheeks pink from tending her roses. "Jane, you're quiet this morning," she said, setting a plate of warm biscuits on the table. "Planning to explore again? The village baker's got a new loaf you might like." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes crinkling. "Perhaps later, Clara. I thought I'd take a closer look at the Miller house. Old places have stories, you know." She kept her tone light, but her fingers tightened around her teacup. Clara's smile wavered, her hands fidgeting with her apron. "That place gives me goosebumps," Clara said, her voice low. "But if you must, be careful. It's been empty so long, the floorboards might be rotten." She hesitated, then added, "Take my umbrella. It might rain." Miss Marple nodded, tucking the key and Clara's umbrella into her handbag. She pulled on her shawl and stepped outside, the cool air sharp with the scent of leaves and earth. Sycamore Street was stirring, doctored. Felix Warren's cottage had its shutters open, a thin wisp of smoke curling from his chimney. Lydia Crane's windows stayed dark, her curtains still drawn. The Hargreaves' home echoed with Thomas's loud voice, arguing about something with Margaret. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the Miller house, its dark silhouette looming at the street's end. The gate creaked as she approached, and she noticed the patch of disturbed earth again, now dusted with fresh dew, as if no one had walked there since yesterday. She pushed the gate open, its hinges groaning, and stepped into the overgrown garden. Nettles and brambles snagged at her skirt, but she moved carefully, her eyes scanning the ground. The footprints she'd seen yesterday were fainter now, blurred by the damp, but they led toward the house's front door. She paused, glancing back at the street. No one was watching, or so it seemed. Sycamore Street had a way of keeping eyes, hidden behind curtains. The key turned stiffly in the lock, and the door opened with a creak that echoed in the still air. Inside, the Miller house smelled of dust and time, its rooms dim despite the morning light. The parlour was tidy but frozen, as if Eliza had stepped out only yesterday. A faded rug lay under a wooden table, a single chair tucked beside it. A bookshelf held novels and a few gardening books, their spines cracked from use. Miss Marple's shoes tapped softly on the floorboards as she moved deeper, her senses alert. The house felt heavy, like it was holding its breath. In the kitchen, a chipped teapot sat on the counter next to a sink with a single plate. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed at a faint mark on the floor, a scuff, fresh and dark, near the back door. Someone had been here, and not long ago. She tested the door. It was locked, but the bolt was loose, as if forced open and repaired. Her heart quickened, but she kept her steps steady, moving to a small study off the hall. The study was a treasure trove of Eliza's life. A desk sat under a window, its surface cluttered with papers and a dried inkwell. Miss Marple's fingers brushed the wood, finding a locked drawer. She glanced around, then pulled a hairpin from her bun, a trick she'd learned years ago in St. Mary Mead. The lock clicked open, revealing a bundle of letters tied with string. Her breath caught as she read the address. Mr. E. Barlow, Postbox 472, London. The handwriting was Eliza's, neat and slanted, but the letters were unsent, their edges yellowed. She slipped one out and read, "Dear Edward, I can't wait much longer. You promised we'd start fresh, but I'm scared. The money's gone, and I don't know who to trust. Come soon, please. Yours, Eliza." Miss Marple's mind raced. Edward Barlow, the stranger at the gate. The letters confirmed Clara's story of a man visiting Eliza, but they hinted at something deeper. Money, fear, a plan to leave. She tucked the letters into her handbag, knowing they were a key to the puzzle. As she closed the drawer, a floorboard creaked behind her, not from her steps. She turned, her heart steady despite the chill in her spine. The room was empty, but the air felt different, like someone had been there moments ago. She left the house, locking the door, and stepped back into the garden. The sky had clouded over, and a light drizzle began, just as Clara had warned. Miss Marple opened the umbrella, her eyes scanning the garden again. Near a gnarled apple tree, she spotted something new, a small flat stone, half buried in the soil. It looked out of place, too smooth for the wild garden. She knelt, brushing dirt away, and found a tiny carving on the stone, a heart with E and E scratched inside. Her lips pursed. Eliza and Edward, perhaps. A lover's mark, hidden in the weeds. Back on Sycamore Street, Miss Marple decided to visit Tommy Hargreaves, hoping to learn more about the noises he'd heard. The Hargreaves' cottage was quieter now. The morning's argument faded. Margaret answered the door, her face drawn, her eyes red-rimmed. "Miss Marple," she said, forcing a smile. "Tommy's out back chopping wood. I'll fetch him." Tommy appeared, his axe slung over his shoulder, his cheeks flushed from work. "Hello, Miss Marple," he said, wiping sweat from his brow. "You went in the Miller house, didn't you? I saw you from the market." Miss Marple nodded, her tone gentle. "I did, Tommy. It's a sad place, isn't it? You mentioned hearing thumps there. Can you tell me more?" Tommy glanced at the house, his hands fidgeting. "It's at night mostly. Soft thumps, like someone's moving furniture. But slow. I told Dad, but he says it's nothing. Mum gets upset when I talk about it." He lowered his voice, leaning closer. "Once I saw a light flicker in the window. Upstairs, late. No one's supposed to be there." Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her mind was sharp. A light, thumps, footprints, a loose bolt. Someone was using the Miller house, and not just for memories. "You're a brave boy, Tommy," she said. "If you hear anything else, will you tell me?" He nodded, his face serious, and Miss Marple left, her umbrella shielding her from the growing rain. Her next stop was the village post office, where Mrs. Dobbs might know more about Eliza's letters. The post office was a tiny shop, its counter cluttered with stamps and parcels. Mrs. Dobbs looked up from sorting mail, her sharp nose twitching like a rabbit's. "Miss Marple, back so soon?" she said, her voice loud but friendly. "What's on your mind?" "I was thinking about Eliza Miller," Miss Marple said, leaning on the counter. "You mentioned her letters to London. Did she ever get replies? Or send anything else? Parcels?" "Maybe," Mrs. Dobbs frowned, tapping a pencil against her chin. "Replies? Not that I saw. Just those weekly letters, always to that post-box. But once, about a month before she vanished, she sent a package, small, wrapped in brown paper. Looked heavy, like a book or a box. She was nervous, kept looking over her shoulder. I asked if she was all right, but she just smiled and left." Miss Marple's mind clicked like her knitting needles. A package sent in secret, tied to Eliza's. Fear. "Thank you, Mrs. Dobbs," she said, her smile warm. "You've a sharp memory." As she stepped outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the streets slick and shiny. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Lydia Crane. That painting of the woman in the garden, too much like Eliza to be chance, nagged at her. She walked to Lydia's cottage, her steps slow but purposeful. The ivy seemed thicker today, like it was guarding the house. She knocked, and after a long pause, Lydia opened the door, her eyes wary. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice tight, "what brings you back?" "I was hoping to talk about your art," Miss Marple said, her tone disarming. "That painting I saw yesterday, the woman in the garden, it felt so real. Did you know Eliza Miller well?" Lydia's face paled, her hand gripping the doorframe. "Not really," she said too quickly. "I paint what I see, that's all. Gardens, people, it's just art." But her eyes darted to the corner where the locked trunk sat, its brass glinting in the dim light. Miss Marple nodded, not pushing. "You see things clearly, Miss Crane. That's a rare gift." She glanced at the trunk, then smiled. "Thank you for your time." As she left, she noticed a small shed behind the cottage, its door padlocked, the lock shiny and new against the weathered wood. Her heart skipped. Another hiding place, perhaps. Back at Clara's, supper was a quiet affair. Potato soup and fresh bread, the fire crackling in the parlour. Clara chatted about the village fair, but Miss Marple's mind was on the Miller house, the unsent letters, the carved stone, the scuff on the floor, Tommy's light, and Lydia's trunk. She jotted in her notebook, "Edward Barlow, lover, thief, package sent before vanishing, she'd locked, light in empty house." The clues were piling up, each one a whisper of Eliza's story. As she climbed into bed, the rain started again, tapping, the window like fingers. She lay awake, listening to Sycamore Street's silence, broken only by the faint creak of the Miller house gate in the wind. Someone was moving in the shadows, and Miss Marple was determined to find out who. Chapter 5. The Weight of Secrets. The morning dawned grey over Sycamore Street, with clouds hanging low like a heavy quilt. Miss Jane Marple sat at Clara Henshaw's kitchen table, her knitting needles resting in her lap, her tea growing cold as her mind worked. The clues she'd gathered buzzed in her head like bees. Eliza Miller's unsent letters to Edward Barlow, hinting at fear and lost money. The carved stone in the Miller garden, marked with E&E. The scuff mark by the back door. Tommy, Hargreaves' talk of thumps and a flickering light in the empty house. And Lydia Crane's painting of a woman who looked like Eliza, hidden in a cottage with a locked shed. The shadow Miss Marple had seen near the Miller house, the footprints in the garden, and the loose bolt on the back door all pointed to someone moving in secret. Today, she decided, she'd press harder, starting with the people closest to Eliza's life. Clara bustled in, her apron tied tight, her hands dusted with sugar from rolling dough for the village fair. "Jane, you look lost in thought," she said, sliding a plate of warm shortbread across the table. "Planning another adventure. The bakery's open if you fancy a treat." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes sharp behind her soft expression. "Perhaps later, Clara. I was thinking of visiting Dr. Warren. A doctor knows his patients' worries, doesn't he?" She didn't mention the Miller house key in her handbag or the letters tucked beside it, but her heart beat faster at the thought of them. Felix Warren's nervous glances and quick words at the market had caught her attention, and she wanted to know why. Clara nodded, though her brow creased. "Felix is a good man, but he's been jumpy lately, always rushing off to patients." She hesitated, then added, "Be gentle with him, Jane. He carries the village's troubles." Miss Marple tucked her knitting into her bag, pulled on her shawl, and stepped into the damp morning. Sycamore Street was quiet, the rain from last night leaving puddles that mirrored the grey sky. The Hargreaves' cottage was silent for once, its windows dark, Lydia Crane's curtains stayed shut, but a thin thread of smoke rose from her chimney, hinting she was awake. The Miller house stood at the street's end, its gate still, its windows blank. Miss Marple's fingers brushed the key in her bag, but she turned toward Dr. Warren's cottage, its green shutters bright against the gloom. She knocked, and Felix opened the door, his dark hair tousled, his medical bag in hand as if ready to leave. "Miss Marple," he said, his smile quick but strained. "What brings you here? Feeling poorly?" "Oh, no," she said, her voice warm. "I just thought a chat might be nice. Clara speaks so highly of you, and I'm curious about life on Sycamore Street." She watched his face, noting the flicker of unease in his eyes. Felix hesitated, then stepped aside. "Come in, then. I've got a few minutes before my rounds." His parlour was tidy, with a small fireplace, a bookshelf of medical journals, and a desk piled with papers. A single photograph hung on the wall, a younger Felix with an older woman, perhaps his mother, smiling in a sunny garden. Miss Marple settled into a chair, her hands folded, her eyes taking in every detail. "Clara tells me you looked after Eliza Miller," she said, her tone gentle, like a neighbour asking after a friend. "It must have been hard, losing a patient like that." Felix's hands paused on his teapot, mid-pour. "Yes, it was," he said, his voice low. "Eliza was healthy mostly. Came in for small things, headaches, a sore wrist. But she was troubled, always looking over her shoulder, like she expected someone to walk in." He set a cup before her, his fingers trembling slightly. "I tried to help, but she didn't talk much. When she vanished, I felt I'd failed her." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes soft but searching. "Did she ever mention a man? Someone from outside Willoughby, perhaps?" Felix's cup clinked against its saucer. "A man? No, not to me, but—" He hesitated, his jaw tightening. "Once, she asked about sleeping draughts, said she wasn't resting well. I gave her a mild tonic, but she seemed scared, not just tired. I should have asked more." His voice cracked and he looked away, toward the window facing the Miller house. Miss Marple noted his guilt, his quick glance. "You did your best," she said kindly. "Sometimes people hide their fears, even from those who care." She paused, then added, "Clara mentioned a stranger at Eliza's gate once. Did you ever see him?" Felix shook his head. "Too fast. No, I keep busy with patients, don't notice much else." But his fingers gripped his cup, and Miss Marple saw the lie in his eyes, small but clear, like a crack in glass. She thanked him and left, her mind turning. Felix knew more than he said. About Eliza, perhaps about the stranger. His guilt wasn't just a doctor's regret. It was heavier, personal. As she stepped onto Sycamore Street, she saw Tommy Hargreaves biking past, a sack of groceries tied to his handlebars. He slowed, his freckled face curious. "Miss Marple, you been to the Miller house again?" he whispered, glancing at his own cottage. "Not today, Tommy," she said, smiling, "but I'm keeping an eye out. Those noises you heard, any more of them?" He nodded, his eyes wide. "Last night, late, thumps again, and I swear I saw someone by the gate. Just a shadow, moving fast. I didn't tell Dad. He'd say, 'I'm dreaming.'" His voice shook, and Miss Marple patted his arm. "You're a sharp boy, Tommy. Keep watching, but stay safe." She watched him pedal off, her thoughts on the shadow. It matched what she'd seen, and now Tommy had seen it too. Someone was visiting the Miller house, and they didn't want to be noticed. Her next stop was the village library, a small stone building near the church, hoping to find old records about Eliza or her mysterious Edward Barlow. The librarian, Miss Agnes Poole, was a wiry woman with grey hair pinned tight and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Miss Marple, welcome," she said, her voice crisp. "Looking for something special?" "Just a bit of history," Miss Marple said, her tone light. "I'm curious about Sycamore Street's past. Any records on the Miller house or its owner?" Miss Agnes led her to a dusty corner, where shelves sagged under old ledgers and newspapers. "Not much on Eliza herself," she said, pulling out a file. "But the house has been there since the 1800s. Eliza bought it after her husband died 10 years ago. Kept to herself, mostly." She handed Miss Marple a stack of village newsletters, their pages brittle. Miss Marple flipped through them, her eyes scanning for Eliza's name. A 1922 article caught her attention. A photo of the village fair, with Eliza holding a prize for her roses. Next to her stood a man, tall and sharp-featured, his hat tilted to hide his face. The caption read, "Eliza Miller and friend enjoy the fair." Miss Marple's heart skipped. Was this Edward Barlow? The man's posture matched Clara's description of the stranger at the gate. "Did you know Eliza well?" Miss Marple asked, tucking the newsletter under her arm. Miss Agnes shrugged, her lips tight. "Not really. She borrowed gardening books, sometimes poetry. Quiet woman, but she stopped coming a few months before she vanished. Looked tired, like she was carrying a weight." She paused, then added, "I heard she sent letters to London. Odd for someone so private." Miss Marple nodded, her mind adding another piece. Eliza's change before her disappearance, the weight Miss Agnes saw. She thanked the librarian and left, the newsletter in her handbag. The rain had started again, a soft drizzle that made Sycamore Street gleam. She decided to revisit Lydia Crane's cottage, the locked shed nagging at her thoughts. The painting of the woman in the garden, the trunk, the new padlock. Lydia was hiding something, and Miss Marple wanted to know what. She knocked, but no answer came. The curtains were parted slightly, and through the window Miss Marple saw Lydia at an easel, her brush moving fast. The shed's padlock glinted in the rain, untouched. Miss Marple hesitated, then walked around, the cottage, her umbrella shielding her. Behind the shed she noticed a patch of earth, muddy and trampled, with a faint trail leading into the trees beyond. The trail was narrow, barely a path, but fresh, as if used recently. Her eyes narrowed. Was Lydia sneaking somewhere, or was someone else using her land? She didn't linger, not wanting to be caught, but the trail stayed in her mind. Back on Sycamore Street, she saw Margaret Hargreaves hurrying toward the market, her basket swinging. Miss Marple caught up, her voice cheerful. "Mrs. Hargreaves, what a lovely day, despite the rain. How's your family?" Margaret's smile was thin, her eyes tired. "Oh, fine, Miss Marple, just busy with the fair." Her hands twisted the basket's handle, and Miss Marple noticed a bruise on her wrist, half hidden by her sleeve. "Tommy's a good lad," Miss Marple said, watching her face. "He's worried about the Miller house. Says he sees things there. Must be hard, living so close to that mystery." Margaret's face paled, her fingers tightening. "He's just a boy, imagining things. That house is empty. Always has been." Her voice was sharp, and she hurried off, her steps quick. Miss Marple watched her go, her mind noting the bruise, the fear in Margaret's eyes. Something was wrong in the Hargreaves' home, tied to the Miller house, perhaps to Tommy's noises. She returned to Clara's cottage, where supper was waiting, lamb stew, warm and hearty. Clara chattered about the fair, but Miss Marple's thoughts were elsewhere. Felix's guilt, Lydia's trail, Margaret's bruise, the newsletter's photo. She jotted in her notebook, "Edward Barlow in photo? Felix hides something. Lydia's trail. Where to? Margaret's fear." The Miller house was the heart of the mystery, and its secrets were spilling into the street. As she climbed into bed, the rain pattered harder, a steady drum against the window. She lay awake, listening for thumps, for shadows. Sycamore Street was whispering, and Miss Marple was ready to hear its truth. Chapter 6. Echoes in the Dark. The night wrapped Sycamore Street in a heavy cloak of silence, broken only by the soft patter of rain on Clara Henshaw's cottage roof. Miss Jane Marple sat by her bedroom window, her knitting untouched, her eyes fixed on the dark shape of the Miller house at the street's end. The clues she'd gathered swirled in her mind like leaves in a storm. Eliza Miller's unsent letters to Edward Barlow, filled with fear and talk of lost money. The carved stone marked E&E in the wild garden. The scuff mark by the back door. Tommy Hargreaves's reports of thumps and a flickering light. Lydia Crane's painting of a woman resembling Eliza, and the trampled trail behind her shed. Dr. Felix Warren's guilty glances, and Margaret Hargreaves' bruise and nervous haste. The shadow Miss Marple had seen near the Miller house, the footprints and the loose bolt all pointed to someone moving in secret. Tonight, she decided, she'd watch and listen, letting the street's whispers guide her. Clara had gone to bed, her snores drifting through the cottage, so Miss Marple slipped on her shawl and settled by the window, her notebook open. The street was still, the lamp-post's glow casting long shadows. Around midnight, a faint sound broke the quiet, a soft thump, like a door easing shut from the direction of the Miller house. Her heart quickened, but she stayed still, her eyes straining in the dark. A shadow moved near the gate, low and quick, vanishing into the garden's tangle of weeds. It was too fleeting to identify, but it matched Tommy's story and her own, glimpsed days ago. Someone was in that house, and they didn't want to be seen. She jotted in her notebook, shadow again, midnight, thump. Door? Someone's there. Closing the book, she resolved to return to the Miller house at dawn, key in hand, to search for more clues. But first, she needed to understand the people of Sycamore Street better, starting with the Hargreaves family, whose tension seemed tied to the mystery. Morning broke with a thin mist, the air damp and cool. Miss Marple joined Clara for breakfast. Poached eggs and toast, the kitchen warm with the scent of brewing tea. Clara chattered about the village fair, her hands busy slicing apples for a pie. "Jane, you must come to the fair tomorrow," she said. "The whole street will be there, showing off their jams and quilts." "Sounds lovely," Miss Marple replied, her smile gentle but her mind elsewhere. "I thought I'd visit the Hargreaves today. Tommy's such a bright boy, and I'd like to meet his father properly." Clara's knife paused, her eyes flicking, to Miss Marple. "Thomas is loud but kind. Margaret's quieter, always busy with the house. Just don't mind their mess. 3 kids keep them running." Her voice held a hint of worry, and Miss Marple noted it, wondering what Clara wasn't saying. After breakfast, Miss Marple pulled on her coat and headed to the Hargreaves' cottage, the Miller house key tucked in her handbag. The street was waking up. Dr. Warren's shutters were open, a patient leaving his door. Lydia Crane's chimney smoked faintly, her curtains still drawn. The Hargreaves' home was alive with noise, children's laughter, a clatter of pots, and Thomas's booming voice singing off-key. Miss Marple knocked, and Margaret opened the door, her face tired, the bruise on her wrist now faded but still visible. "Miss Marple," Margaret said, forcing a smile. "Come in. It's a bit wild today." She led her into a cluttered parlour, where toys and newspapers littered the floor. 2 young girls played with dolls in a corner, and Thomas stood by the mantel, polishing a brass clock. "Hello, Miss Marple," Thomas said, his grin wide but his eyes cautious. "Heard you're poking around the village. Clara keeping you busy?" "She's a wonderful host," Miss Marple said, settling into a chair. "I met Tommy at the market. He's got sharp eyes, doesn't he? Notice things about the Miller house. Noises, lights." Thomas's grin faded, his hand tightening on the clock. "Boys always making up stories. Empty houses creak, that's all. Nothing to fuss over." His voice was gruff, and Margaret's hands twisted a dishcloth, her eyes on the floor. Miss Marple tilted her head, her tone soft. "It's strange, though, isn't it? An empty house making noises. Tommy said he saw a light, too. Makes you wonder who's been there." Margaret's head snapped up, her voice sharp. "It's just an old house. Tommy's young, sees things that aren't there." But her hands shook, and Miss Marple saw fear in her eyes, not just irritation. Before she could press further, Tommy burst in, his cheeks red from running. "Miss Marple, I was at the market and—" He stopped, seeing his parents' faces, and mumbled, "Sorry, I'll go help Mum." He darted to the kitchen, but Miss Marple caught his glance, a mix of worry and trust. She stayed a bit longer, chatting about the fair to ease the tension, but her mind was on Margaret's fear and Thomas's quick dismissal. As she left, she paused by the gate, catching Tommy's eye. He slipped outside, pretending to adjust his bike. "Miss Marple," he whispered, "I heard it again last night. Thumps and a creak, like someone walking. I didn't tell Dad. He gets mad." "You're doing right to tell me," Miss Marple said, her voice low. "Anything else? Did you see that shadow again?" Tommy nodded, his eyes wide. "Near the back door this time. I was scared, so I didn't stay." He glanced at the cottage, then added, "Mum's been weird since I mentioned the noises. Keeps telling me to stay away." Miss Marple patted his shoulder. "Keep your eyes open, Tommy, but don't take risks." She watched him go, her thoughts heavy. The Hargreaves were hiding something, and it wasn't just Tommy's imagination. Her next stop was the Miller house. The mist had lifted, leaving the garden damp and glistening. She unlocked the door, the creak loud in the quiet morning. Inside, the air was still, heavy with dust. She moved to the study, checking the desk again, but found nothing new. The scuff mark by the back door caught her eye, and she noticed something she'd missed before. A faint smear of mud, fresh and dark, leading to a narrow staircase. Her heart beat faster as she climbed, her hand steady on the banister. Up the stairs, the hallway was dim, with 3 closed doors. The first led to a bedroom, its bed neatly made, a faded quilt folded at the foot. The second was a storage room, filled with boxes and old furniture. The third door was locked, but the keyhole showed scratches, as if someone had forced it open. Miss Marple used her hairpin again, the lock clicking softly. Inside was a small attic, its single window boarded up. A lantern sat on the floor, its wick recently burned, and a pile of blankets lay in a corner, rumpled as if used. Her breath caught. Someone had been here, hiding, sleeping perhaps. She searched the attic, finding a scrap of paper tucked under a blanket. It was a torn receipt, dated 3 years ago, for a train ticket to London in Eliza's name. Miss Marple's mind raced. Had Eliza planned to leave, or had someone else used this ticket? She pocketed the receipt, her eyes scanning the room. A faint scratch on the floor led to a loose board. She pried it up, revealing a small tin box, rusted but intact. Inside was a locket, silver and heart-shaped, with a tiny photo of Eliza and the same sharp-featured man from the newsletter photo. On the back, engraved faintly, was E.B. Miss Marple closed the box, her thoughts whirling. Edward Barlow, the man in the letters, the stranger at the gate, now in a locket hidden in a secret attic. She left the house, locking it carefully, and headed to the village hall, where old records might shed light on Edward Barlow. The hall was a squat building, its walls lined with notices and photos. The clerk, a young man named Peter, greeted her with a shy smile. "Miss Marple, looking for something?" "Old records," she said, her tone friendly. "Anything about visitors to Willoughby, say, 3 or 4 years ago?" Peter rummaged through a filing cabinet, pulling out a guest book from the village inn. "This might help. Folks sign in when they stay." Miss Marple flipped through the pages, her finger stopping at an entry from October 1922. Edward Barlow, London. The signature was bold, matching the handwriting on Eliza's letters. Her heart skipped. Barlow had been here just before Eliza vanished. "Thank you, Peter," she said, her smile warm. As she left, she saw Lydia Crane across the street, sketching under a tree, her eyes flicking towards the Miller house. Miss Marple decided to try her again, hoping to loosen her guard. She approached, slowly, her umbrella tapping the ground. "Miss Crane, your sketches are lovely," she said. "Do you ever draw the Miller house? It's so striking." Lydia's pencil stopped, her face tightening. "I don't draw that place," she said, her voice sharp. "Too gloomy." But her sketchbook slipped, revealing a drawing of a garden gate, unmistakably the Miller house's, with a shadowy figure beside it. She snapped the book shut, her cheeks red. Miss Marple nodded, not pushing. "It's a shame. Such a pretty garden once." She glanced at the shed, its padlock gleaming. "You must see a lot from your cottage." Lydia's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing, turning back to her sketch. Miss Marple left, her mind on the drawing, the trail behind the shed, and Lydia's quick hands. Back at Clara's, supper was fish pie, the kitchen cosy despite the drizzle outside. Clara talked about the fair, but Miss Marple's thoughts were on the attic, the locket, and Barlow's signature. She jotted in her notebook, "Barlow here, 1922. Locket in attic. Someone hiding there." Lydia's sketch, shadow. Sycamore Street's silence was cracking, and Miss Marple was ready to hear its secrets. Chapter 7. The Brewery's Shadow. The morning mist hung low over Sycamore Street, wrapping the cottages in a soft grey veil. Miss Jane Marple sat at Clara Henshaw's kitchen table, her knitting needle still, her tea steaming in a chipped cup. Her mind churned with the clues she'd gathered. Eliza Miller's unsent letters to Edward Barlow, pleading and fearful. The carved E&E stone in the overgrown Miller garden. The scuff mark and loose bolt at the house's back door. Tommy Hargreaves' tales of thumps and a flickering light. Lydia Crane's painting of a woman like Eliza and the trampled trail behind her shed. Dr. Felix Warren's guilty glances. Margaret Hargreaves' bruise and nervous silence. The hidden attic with its lantern and blankets. And the locket with a photo of Eliza and a man marked E.B. The guest book's signature confirmed Edward Barlow's visit to Willoughby just before Eliza vanished. Last night's shadow and thump near the Miller house lingered in her thoughts, a sign someone was still creeping through its secrets. Today, Miss Marple decided, she'd dig into the Hargreaves family, whose fear seemed tied to the heart of the mystery. Clara bustled in, her apron dusted with cinnamon from baking for the village fair. "Jane, you're quiet again," she said, sliding a plate of warm scones across the table. "Thinking of the fair? It's today, you know. Everyone's going. Music, games, the lot." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes sharp behind her gentle expression. "I wouldn't miss it, Clara. But first, I thought I'd visit the Hargreaves Brewery. Thomas runs it, doesn't he? A man's work often tells you about him." She didn't mention the key in her handbag or the locket tucked beside it, but her heart beat faster at the thought of Tommy's whispers and Margaret's hidden bruise. Clara's smile faltered, her hands pausing on a scone. "Thomas's brewery is the pride of Willoughby, but he's a busy man. Loud, too. Margaret's always rushing about for him. Mind their tempers, Jane. They've got 3 kids to wrangle." Her voice held a warning, and Miss Marple noted it. sensing Clara knew more about the Hargreaves than she let on. After breakfast, Miss Marple pulled on her coat and scarf, the air chilly with the promise of more rain. Sycamore Street was stirring, its cottages glowing faintly through the mist. Dr. Warren's shutters were open, his chimney smoking. Lydia Crane's cottage stayed dark, her curtains drawn tight. The Miller house loomed at the street's end, its gate still, but Miss Marple's eyes caught a new detail. A fresh twig snapped on a bush near the fence, as if someone had brushed past in the night. She filed it away, her thoughts on the brewery. The Hargreaves Brewery was a sturdy brick building on the edge of Willoughby, its chimneys puffing and its yard stacked with barrels. The air smelled of malt and hops, sharp and warm. Miss Marple knocked at the office door, and Thomas Hargreaves appeared, his face red and sweaty, his shirt sleeves rolled up. "Miss Marple," he boomed, wiping his hands on a rag. "Come to see the magic of Willoughby ale. Step in, step in." The office was cluttered with ledgers and beer bottles, a map of delivery routes pinned to the wall. Thomas offered her a chair, his grin wide but his eyes wary. "What brings you here? Clara send you to spy on my brews?" he joked, but his laugh was too loud, like a drum hiding a creak. "I'm just curious," Miss Marple said, her tone soft. "A brewery's the heart of a village, isn't it? Clara says you knew Eliza Miller. Such a sad story, her vanishing." Thomas's grin faded, his hand gripping a bottle. "Aye, sad indeed. Eliza was a good sort, always buying my ale for her church teas. But she kept to herself, didn't know her well." His voice was gruff, and he turned to shuffle papers, avoiding her eyes. Miss Marple tilted her head, her smile gentle. "Tommy mentioned noises at her house, thumps, lights. Odd for an empty place, don't you think?" Thomas snorted, his fingers tightening. "Boy's got a head full of tales. Old houses make noises, nothing more." But his jaw clenched, and Miss Marple saw a flicker of unease, like a shadow crossing his face. Before she could press further, Margaret burst in, her apron smudged with flour, her hair escaping its bun. "Miss Marple, didn't know you were here," she said, her voice tight. "Thomas, the fair needs those extra barrels by noon." Her eyes darted to Miss Marple, then away, and Miss Marple noticed her hands, still bruised, though the marks were fading. "Margaret, you work so hard," Miss Marple said, her tone warm. "It must be tough, living so close to the Miller house. Tommy says it's spooky." Margaret's hands froze on her apron, her face paling. "It's just an old house," she said too quickly. "Tommy's young, sees ghosts where there's only dust." She turned to Thomas, her voice sharp. "We need to get moving, Thomas." He nodded, and Miss Marple took her leave, sensing the tension crackling between them. Outside, she spotted Tommy unloading barrels from a cart, his lanky frame bent under the weight. He saw her and straightened, his cheeks flushed. "Miss Marple, you came to the brewery?" he said, glancing at the office door. "Dad's in a mood today." "He's busy, I expect," Miss Marple said, her eyes kind. "Tommy, those noises. You heard any more last night?" Tommy nodded, his voice low. "Yeah, after midnight. Thumps again, like someone dragging something. And I saw that shadow by the back door. Didn't tell Mum. She gets upset." He hesitated, then added, "I heard Dad and Mum arguing about Eliza once, before she went away. Something about money she owed Dad. He was mad, said she'd cheated him. Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her face stayed calm. Money? That's interesting, Tommy. Don't worry, I'll keep it quiet. You're a brave boy for telling me. She patted his arm, her mind racing. A debt to Thomas, an argument, Margaret's fear, new pieces in the puzzle. She decided to revisit the Miller house, the key burning a hole in her handbag. The mist had thickened, cloaking Sycamore Street in a dreamy haze. She slipped through the gate, the snapped twigs still fresh in her mind. Inside, the house was as silent as ever, the air heavy with dust. She climbed to the attic, checking the lantern and blankets, untouched since yesterday. But as she turned to leave, she noticed a faint mark on the wall near the boarded window, a smudge like a handprint too large for Eliza's. Her breath caught. Someone bigger, stronger had been here. Downstairs, she checked the back door again, finding a new clue. A tiny scrap of cloth, blue and frayed, caught on a splinter. It looked like a piece from a man's jacket, not Eliza's style. She tucked it into her handkerchief, her thoughts on Thomas's work clothes and Felix's nervous glances. Someone was using this house, and they were careless. Her next stop was the village fair, hoping to watch Sycamore Street's residents in one place. The fair was in full swing, the square alive with music, laughter, and the smell of roasted chestnuts. Stalls lined the cobblestones, offering pies, quilts, and jars of honey. Miss Marple wandered, her eyes sharp, noting the villagers' faces. Dr. Warren stood by a cider stall, chatting with a farmer. But his smile was tight, his eyes scanning the crowd. Lydia Crane sat under a tree, sketching, her pencil moving fast, her gaze flicking towards the Miller House Road. Margaret Hargreaves manned a jam stall, her hands busy but her face pale, while Thomas laughed loudly nearby, passing out ale samples. Miss Marple approached Margaret's stall, buying a jar of plum jam. "You've outdone yourself, Mrs. Hargreaves," she said, her tone warm. "It must be hard, working so much with the brewery and the fair. Did Eliza ever help with these events?" Margaret's hands shook, a jar wobbling. "Eliza? Oh, yes, she baked for the fair, always generous." Her voice was strained, and she glanced at Thomas, who was watching them, his grin fading. "Tommy mentioned she and Thomas had words once," Miss Marple said softly, her eyes gentle. "Something about money?" Margaret's face went white, her fingers gripping the table. "That's nonsense," she snapped. "Tommy's got it wrong. Eliza was a friend." She turned away, busying herself with jars, and Miss Marple stepped back, her mind noting the panic in her voice. She moved to Lydia's tree, pausing to admire her sketch. A child playing near a stall, vivid and quick. "You capture life so well, Miss Crane," Miss Marple said. "Ever draw people from memory? Eliza, perhaps?" Lydia's pencil stopped, her eyes narrowing. "I told you, I don't draw that house," she said, her voice low. "Or her. I stick to what's in front of me." But her sketchbook trembled, and Miss Marple saw a corner of another drawing. A gate, like the Miller houses, with a faint figure beside it. "You see so much," Miss Marple said, her smile kind. "It's a gift." She left, her thoughts on Lydia's drawings and the trail behind her shed. Was Lydia watching the Miller house, or hiding something there? At the fair's edge, she found Tommy tossing rings at a game stall. his face bright until he saw her. "Miss Marple," he whispered, stepping close. "I didn't tell you before, but I found something near the Miller house, by the gate, a button, shiny, like from a fancy coat. I hid it in my room. Didn't want Dad to know." Miss Marple's eyes lit up, though her face stayed calm. "A button? That's clever of you, Tommy. Can you show me later?" He nodded, glancing at his parents' stall. "After the fair, when they're busy." He darted back to the game, and Miss Marple moved on, her mind on the button, the cloth scrap, the handprint. Someone was leaving traces, and they weren't as careful as they thought. Back at Clara's, supper was shepherd's pie, the kitchen warm and cosy. Clara talked about the fair's success, but Miss Marple's thoughts were on the brewery, the attic, and Tommy's button. She jotted in her notebook, Thomas's debt story, Margaret's panic, handprint in attic, cloth scrap, man's jacket, button found. Sycamore Street's secrets were growing louder, and Miss Marple was closer to hearing them. As she climbed into bed, the mist outside thickened, muffling the world. She listened for thumps, for shadows, knowing the Miller house was alive with secrets, waiting for her to uncover them. Chapter 8. The Trail in the Trees. The morning sun broke through the mist over Sycamore Street, casting a pale glow on the wet cobblestones. Miss Jane Marple sat in Clara Henshaw's cosy parlour, her knitting needles quiet in her lap, a cup of tea steaming beside her. Her mind buzzed with the clues she'd gathered. Eliza Miller's unsent letters to Edward Barlow, filled with fear over lost money, the carved E&E stone in the Miller garden, the scuff mark and loose bolt at the house's back door, Tommy Hargreaves's stories of thumps and a flickering light, Lydia Crane's painting of a woman like Eliza, and the trampled trail behind her shed, Dr. Felix Warren's guilty glances, Margaret Hargreaves's bruise and quick denials, the hidden attic with its lantern blankets and handprint, the locket with Eliza and a man marked E.B., the train ticket receipt, Edward Barlow's signature in the inn's guest book, and Tommy's find of a shiny button near the Miller gate, paired with the blue cloth scrap from a man's jacket, the shadow Miss Marple had seen, the fresh twig snapped near the gate, and Thomas Hargreaves' argument with Eliza over money, all pointed to a secret kept alive in the empty house. Today, she decided, she'd follow the trail behind Lydia's, shed and confront the heart of Sycamore Street's silence. Clara bustled in, her apron smudged with jam from her fair preparations. "Jane, you're staring out that window like it's got answers," she said, setting a plate of warm muffins on the table. "Coming to the fair's last day. There's a dance tonight and everyone's talking about it." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes sharp behind her gentle expression. "I'll be there, Clara, but first I've a few errands. I might stop by Miss Crane's again. Her sketches are so striking." She didn't mention the trail or the button Tommy promised to show her, but her heart beat faster at the thought of them. The trail could lead to answers, and the button might point to the shadow's owner. Clara's brow creased, her hands twisting a napkin. "Lydia's a strange one, Jane. Keeps to herself, always drawing. Be careful, she doesn't like nosy visitors." Her voice held a warning, and Miss Marple noted it, sensing Clara's unease about the artist. After breakfast, Miss Marple pulled on her coat and scarf, the air cool and damp from last night's rain. Sycamore Street was waking, its cottages soft in the morning light. Dr. Warren's shutters were open, a patient's bicycle propped by his gate. The Hargreaves' home hummed with the clatter of breakfast dishes. The Miller house stood silent, its windows dark. Lydia Crane's cottage was still, but a faint light glowed behind her curtains, suggesting she was up. Miss Marple headed there, first determined to learn more about the trail and the painting. She knocked, and after a long pause, Lydia opened the door a crack, her dark eyes wary. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice sharp. "Back again! I'm working!" Her hand gripped the door, her knuckles white. "I won't keep you," Miss Marple said, her tone warm. "I just wanted to ask about your garden. That shed out back. It looks sturdy. Do you use it for painting supplies?" Her eyes flicked to the shed, its shiny padlock glinting in the sun. Lydia's face tightened. Her voice clipped. "It's for storage. Old canvases, tools. Nothing special." She started to close the door, but Miss Marple's gentle smile held her. "It's such a pretty spot," Miss Marple said. "I noticed a path behind it, leading into the trees. A lovely place for a walk, isn't it?" Lydia's eyes widened, her hand trembling. "I don't walk there," she said too quickly. "Just weeds and mud. Excuse me, I've got work." She shut the door, the lock clicking sharply. Miss Marple stood a moment, her mind racing. Lydia's panic confirmed the trail was important. She walked around the cottage, careful not to be seen, and found the trampled path again, its mud still, soft from the rain. It wound through a cluster of oaks, their branches low and tangled. She followed it, her sensible shoes sinking slightly, her eyes scanning for clues. The trail ended at a small clearing, where a pile of charred wood and ash lay, as if someone had burned something recently. Nearby, half buried in the dirt, was a broken paintbrush, its handle marked with LC. Miss Marple's breath caught. Lydia had been here, destroying something. Papers, perhaps, or another painting. She pocketed the paintbrush, her thoughts on Lydia's sketch of the Miller gate and the shadowy figure. Was Lydia hiding her own secret or protecting someone else's? Miss Marple returned to the street, her heart steady, but her mind alight. Her next stop was the Hargreaves' cottage, to see Tommy's button. The Hargreaves' home was quieter now. The children at school. Margaret answered the door, her face drawn, her bruise barely visible, but still there. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice tired. "Thomas is at the brewery, and Tommy's out running errands." "I was hoping to see Tommy," Miss Marple said, her smile kind. "He mentioned finding something interesting. I'll catch him later, perhaps." She paused, watching Margaret's face. "You must be busy with the fair. Did Eliza ever help with your stall?" Margaret's hands twisted her apron, her eyes flicking to the Miller house. "Eliza? Yes, she brought cakes sometimes. She was kind." Her voice shook and she stepped back. "I've got to finish packing for the fair. Excuse me." Miss Marple nodded, noting the fear in Margaret's eyes, the same fear she'd seen when Tommy mentioned the noises. As she left, she saw Tommy biking up, his sack bouncing. He stopped, his freckled face bright. "Miss Marple, I got the button. Hid it in my room. Want to see?" "Very much," she said, her voice low. They slipped into the garden, away from the cottage windows. Tommy pulled a small tin from his pocket, opening it to reveal a shiny brass button, engraved with a tiny anchor, "Found it by the Miller gate," he whispered. "It's not Dad's or anyone I know." Miss Marple's eyes lit up, though her face stayed calm. "You're clever, Tommy. Keep this safe and don't tell anyone yet." The button didn't match Thomas's work clothes or Felix's plain jackets, but it could belong to Edward Barlow, the city man in the locket. She thanked Tommy and headed to the village fair, hoping to watch Sycamore Street's residents together. The fair was bustling, the square filled with laughter, music, and the smell of fried dough. Stalls overflowed with pies, knitted scarves, and jars of pickles. Miss Marple wandered, her eyes sharp. Dr. Warren stood by a game booth, tossing balls with a forced smile, his gaze darting to the crowd. Lydia Crane sat on a bench, sketching, her pencil quick but her eyes restless, flicking toward the Miller House Road. Margaret manned the jam stall, her hands busy but her face pale, while Thomas handed out ale, his laugh loud but his eyes watchful. Miss Marple approached Thomas's stall, buying a small bottle of ale. "You've a gift for brewing," she said, her tone warm. "Clara says you and Eliza were friends. Did she ever visit the brewery?" Thomas's laugh died, his hand tightening on a bottle. "Eliza? Aye, she bought ale for her teas. Good customer, but we weren't close." He glanced at Margaret, who was watching them, her face tight. "She owed me a bit of money, mind you. Nothing big, just a tab she never paid." Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her smile stayed soft. "A debt? That must have been hard, with your business to run." Thomas shrugged, his eyes avoiding hers. "Water under the bridge. She's gone now." He turned to another customer, and Miss Marple stepped away, her thoughts on the debt, Tommy's story of the argument, and Margaret's fear. She moved to Lydia's bench, pausing to admire her sketch. A lively scene of the fair, but with a dark edge, shadows creeping in. "You see so much, Miss Crane," Miss Marple said. "That trail behind your shed. Does it lead anywhere special?" Lydia's pencil snapped, her face paling. "I told you, it's just weeds," she said, her voice sharp. "I don't go there." But her hands shook, and Miss Marple saw a smudge of ash on her sleeve, faint but fresh. "You've a keen eye," Miss Marple said, her smile disarming. "It sees things others miss." She left, her mind on the charred wood, the broken paintbrush, and Lydia's ash-stained sleeve. At the fair's edge, she found Dr. Warren, now alone, sipping cider. "Miss Marple," he said, his smile strained, "enjoying the fair?" "Very much," she said, her eyes gentle. "You must know everyone's secrets, being their doctor. Did Eliza ever share hers?" Felix's cup froze halfway to his lips. "Eliza? She was private, came for headaches, nothing serious, but she was scared near the end, didn't say why." His voice cracked, and he looked toward the Miller house, his eyes haunted. Miss Marple nodded, noting his guilt, the same guilt she'd seen before. "Fear makes people hide things," she said softly. "Even from kind doctors." She left him, her thoughts on his words, the locket, the button. Back at Clara's, supper was roast beef, the kitchen warm with the scent of rosemary. Clara talked about the dance, but Miss Marple's mind was on the trail, the button, the ash. She jotted in her notebook, "Lydia burns something. Paintings? Thomas's debt confirmed. Felix's fear. Button? Barlow's." Sycamore Street's silence was unravelling, and Miss Marple was close to its truth. As she lay in bed, the night quiet except for the distant fair music. She listened for thumps, for shadows. The Miller house was calling, and she was ready to answer. Chapter 9. Pieces of the Puzzle. The dawn light crept over Sycamore Street, painting the wet cobblestones in soft pinks and golds. Miss Jane Marple sat by Clara Henshaw's parlour window, her knitting untouched, a cup of tea cooling in her hands. Her mind was a whirl of clues, each a thread in the tangled web of Eliza Miller's disappearance. The unsent letters to Edward Barlow, hinting at lost money and fear. The carved E&E stone in the Miller garden. The scuff mark and loose bolt at the house's back door. Tommy Hargreaves's tales of thumps and a flickering light. Lydia Crane's painting of a woman like Eliza, and the trampled trail behind her shed, leading to charred wood and a broken paintbrush. Dr. Felix Warren's guilty glances, Margaret Hargreaves' bruise and quick denials, the hidden attic with its lantern, blankets, and large handprint, the locket with Eliza and a man marked E.B., the train ticket receipt, Edward Barlow's signature in the inn's guest book, the blue cloth scrap from a man's jacket, Thomas's debt dispute with Eliza, and the shiny anchor-engraved button Tommy found near the Miller gate, the shadow Miss Marple had seen, the snapped twig, and Lydia's ash-stained sleeve all pointed to someone hiding in the Miller house, guarding a secret. Today, she decided, she'd piece these clues together, starting with a return to Lydia's, shared in a talk with the village constable. Clara bustled in, her apron speckled with flour from early baking. "Jane, you're up with the birds," she said, setting a plate of warm crumpets on the table. "The fair's dance is tonight. Everyone's buzzing about it. Coming along?" Miss Marple smiled, her eyes sharp behind her gentle gaze. "I wouldn't miss it, Clara. But first, I've a few things to do. I might stop by Miss Crane's again. Her garden's so intriguing." She didn't mention the shed's padlock or Tommy's button, tucked safely in her handbag, but her heart beat faster at the thought of them. The trail behind Lydia's cottage was a key, and she needed to unlock its secrets. Clara's smile wavered, her hands fidgeting with a dishcloth. "Lydia's prickly, Jane. Doesn't like folks poking around. Be careful, won't you?" Her voice carried a hint of worry, and Miss Marple noted it, sensing Clara's unease about the artist's solitude. After breakfast, Miss Marple pulled on her coat and scarf, the air crisp with the scent of damp leaves. Sycamore Street was quiet, its cottages soft in the morning glow. Dr. Warren's shutters were open, a faint hum of voices drifting from his door. The Hargreaves' home was still, the children likely at school. The Miller house loomed dark, its gate shut tight. Lydia Crane's cottage showed a wisp of smoke from the chimney, a sign she was awake. Miss Marple headed there, her steps light but purposeful, determined to see inside that shed. She knocked, and Lydia opened the door a sliver, her dark eyes sharp like a hawk's. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice tight, "I'm busy painting. What do you want?" Her hand gripped the doorframe, her sleeve clean today, no ash in sight. "I was admiring your garden," Miss Marple said, her tone warm. "That shed out back, it's so well kept. Mind if I take a peek? I'm fond of old tools." Her eyes flicked to the shed, its padlock gleaming in the sun. Lydia's face stiffened, her voice sharp. "It's just junk, brushes, cans, nothing to see." She started to close the door, but Miss Marple's gentle smile held her. "It's Such a charming spot, Miss Marple said. I noticed a path behind it, into the trees. Do you walk there for inspiration? Lydia's hand trembled, her eyes flashing. I don't walk there, she snapped. It's muddy, useless. I've got work to do. She shut the door, the lock clicking fast. Miss Marple lingered, her mind racing. Lydia's fear confirmed the shed held something important. She circled to the back, careful to stay out of sight from the cottage windows. The padlock was still locked, but the ground near the shed showed fresh footprints, larger than Lydia's, leading to the trail. Her heart quickened. Someone else had been here, using the path to the clearing with the charred wood. She followed the trail again, her shoes sinking into the soft earth. In the clearing, the ash pile was undisturbed, but she spotted a new clue, a scrap of burned paper, its edge showing a faint sketch of a woman's face, half charred, but eerily like Eliza. Miss Marple tucked it into her handkerchief, her thoughts on Lydia's paintings and her quick denials. She returned to Sycamore Street, deciding to visit Tommy before heading to the constable. The Hargreaves' cottage was quiet, the fair keeping the family busy. Tommy was in the yard, fixing his bike, his freckled face bright until he saw her. Miss Marple, he whispered, glancing at the house. You want the button? I kept it, safe. Very clever, Tommy, she said, her voice low. He slipped into the house and returned with the tin, the anchor-engraved button glinting inside. She examined it, noting its weight and shine. Too fine for a villager's coat, more like a city man's. You're a sharp boy, she said. Any more noises last night? Tommy nodded, his eyes wide. Thumps again, late. And I saw a man near the Miller house, by the back door. Tall, wearing a dark coat. He was gone before I could see his face. His voice shook, and Miss Marple patted his arm. You're brave to tell me, she said. Keep this quiet for now. The man in the dark coat matched the shadow, the footprints, and perhaps the locket's E.B. Her mind spun with possibilities. Edward Barlow, back in Willoughby, hiding in the Miller house. Her next stop was the village constable, Mr. Henry Cole, whose office was a small room beside the village hall. He was a stout man with a grey moustache, his desk cluttered with reports. Miss Marple, he said, standing to shake her hand. Clara says you're visiting. Something on your mind? I'm curious about Eliza Miller, Miss Marple said, her tone gentle. Her disappearance left quite a mark. Have you any records of strangers in Willoughby around that time? A man named Edward Barlow, perhaps? Mr. Cole's brow furrowed, his fingers tapping a pencil. Barlow? Name's familiar. We looked into everyone after Eliza vanished, but found nothing solid. Let me check. He pulled a file from a cabinet, flipping through yellowed pages. Here, Edward Barlow, signed. The Inn's Guest Book, October 1922. London address, no details. We tried tracing him, but the postbox he used was a dead end. No one saw him after Eliza went missing. Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her face stayed calm. Did Eliza ever mention trouble? Debts, perhaps, or someone she feared? Cole shook his head. She was quiet, kept to herself. Some said she had a sweetheart, but no proof. The case went cold fast. Nobody, no clues. He paused, his eyes narrowing. You think there's more to it, don't you? Just curious, Miss Marple said, smiling. Old mysteries have a way of lingering. She thanked him and left, her thoughts on Barlow's dead-end postbox and the burned sketch. The constable's file confirmed Barlow's presence, but his disappearance suggested he was hiding something, or someone. The fair's final day was in full swing, the square alive with fiddles and the scent of baked apples. Miss Marple wandered, her eyes sharp. Dr. Warren stood by a pie stall, his smile tight, his hands fidgeting with a napkin. Margaret Hargreaves manned her jam stall, her face pale, her eyes darting to Thomas, who laughed loudly nearby, passing out ale. Lydia Crane sat on a bench sketching, her pencil quick but her gaze restless, flicking toward the Miller House Road. Miss Marple approached Lydia first, pausing to admire her sketch. A lively dance scene, but with a dark corner where a shadowy figure stood. "You capture the fair so well," she said, her tone warm. "That figure in the corner, does it remind you of anyone?" Lydia's pencil froze, her face paling. "It's just a sketch," she said, her voice sharp. "I draw what I see." But her hands shook, and Miss Marple noticed a smudge of paint on her fingers, blue like the cloth scrap from the Miller house. "You see so much," Miss Marple said, her smile disarming. "It's a rare gift." She moved on, her thoughts on the sketch, the paint and the trail. At Margaret's stall, she bought a jar of raspberry jam. "You're working hard," Miss Marple said, her eyes gentle. "Tommy's worried about the Miller house. Says he saw a man there last night. Must be unsettling living so close." Margaret's jar slipped, nearly falling. "Tommy's imagining things," she snapped, her voice trembling. "That house is empty. Always has been." Her eyes flicked to Thomas, who was watching them, his grin gone. Miss Marple nodded, noting the panic in her voice. "It's hard when children worry," she said softly. "Eliza's story must weigh on you all." She stepped away, her thoughts on Margaret's fear, Thomas's debt, and Tommy's man in the dark coat. She found Dr. Warren by the dance floor, watching couples twirl. "Miss Marple," he said, his smile forced, "enjoying the fair?" "Very much," she said, her eyes kind. "You must hear so much as a doctor. Did Eliza ever talk about leaving Willoughby? Maybe for London?" Felix's face tightened, his napkin shredding in his hands. "She hinted at it once. Said she had plans, but didn't say what. She was scared, though. Kept looking out my window, like someone was watching." He paused, his voice low. "I should have done more." "You did your best," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle. "Some secrets are hard to share." She left him, her mind on his words, the locket, the button. Back at Clara's, supper was chicken stew, the kitchen warm with the scent of thyme. Clara chattered about the dance, but Miss Marple's thoughts were on the burned sketch, the footprints, the man in the dark coat. She jotted in her notebook, Barlow's postbox dead end, Lydia's burned sketch, Eliza's face. Nodlin the dark coat, Barlow. Sycamore Street secrets were close to breaking, and Miss Marple was ready to pull them free. As she lay in bed, the fair's music faint in the distance, she listened for thumps, for shadows. The Miller house was whispering, and she was almost ready to answer. Chapter 10. The silence broken. The morning sun rose over Sycamore Street, its golden light piercing the last wisps of mist that clung to the cottages. Miss Jane Marple sat in Clara Henshaw's cosy parlour, her knitting needles still, her tea untouched, as her mind wove together the final threads of the mystery. The clues had piled up like stones in a wall. Eliza Miller's unsent letters to Edward Barlow, filled with fear and talk of lost money, the carved E&E stone in the Miller garden, the scuff mark and loose bolt at the house's back door, Tommy Hargreaves' reports of thumps and a flickering light, Lydia Crane's painting of a woman like Eliza, and the trampled trail behind, her shed leading to charred wood and a broken paintbrush, Dr. Felix Warren's guilty glances, Margaret Hargreaves's bruise and quick denials, the hidden attic with its lantern, blankets and large handprint, the locket with Eliza, and a man marked E.B., the train ticket receipt, Edward Barlow's signature in the inn's guest book, the blue cloth scrap from a man's jacket, Thomas's debt dispute with Eliza, the shiny anchor-engraved button Tommy found, the burned sketch of Eliza's face, larger footprints by Lydia's shed, and Tommy's sighting of a man in a dark coat, the shadow Miss Marple had seen, the snapped twig, and Lydia's ash-stained sleeve all pointed to someone hiding in the Miller house, guarding a secret that had silenced Sycamore Street for 3 years. Today, she decided, she'd unravel it, all with the help of the village constable. Clara bustled in, her apron dusted with sugar from baking for the fair's final clean-up. "Jane, you're staring out that window again," she said, setting a plate of warm biscuits on the table. "The fair's over, but the village is still buzzing. Planning to rest today?" Miss Marple smiled, her eyes sharp behind her gentle gaze. "Not quite, Clara. I thought I'd visit Constable Cole. There's something I need to share about the Miller house." She didn't mention the locket or Tommy's button in her handbag, but her heart beat faster at the thought of the truth waiting to be uncovered. Clara's hands paused, her face paling. "The Miller house? Jane, you've been poking around there too much. It's not safe." Her voice trembled, and Miss Marple noted the worry, sensing Clara's fear of what might be found. "I'll be careful," Miss Marple said, pulling on her coat and scarf. The air outside was crisp, the cobblestones gleaming from last night's rain. Sycamore Street was quiet, its cottages soft in the morning light. Dr. Warren's shutters were open, a patient's cart parked by his gate. The Hargreaves' home was still, the children likely helping at the fair clean-up. Lydia Crane's curtains were drawn, but a faint light glowed inside. The Miller house stood dark, its gate shut, but Miss Marple's eyes caught a new detail, a fresh scratch on the gate's iron, as if something heavy had scraped it in the night. She headed to the constable's office, a small room beside the village hall where Mr. Henry Cole sat at his desk, his grey moustache twitching as he sorted papers. "Miss Marple," he said, standing to greet her. "Back so soon? Got more questions about Eliza?" "I've found something," she said, her tone gentle but firm. She set the locket, the button, the cloth scrap, the burned sketch, and the train ticket receipt on his desk. These came from the Miller house and Lydia Crane's trail. Tommy Hargreaves saw a man in a dark coat there last night, and I've seen a shadow myself. Someone's been using that house, Mr. Cole, and I think it's tied to Edward Barlow." Mr. Cole's eyes widened, his fingers brushing the locket. "Barlow, the London fellow. We couldn't trace him before." He examined the button, its anchor glinting. "This is fancy, city-made, not local. And this sketch looks like Eliza." He leaned back, his face serious. "You're saying someone's hiding there now?" "I believe so," Miss Marple said. "The attic has blankets, a lantern, a handprint. Too big for Eliza. The back door's bolt is loose, and there are footprints, fresh scratches. I think Barlow came back, and he's connected to Elizaso Shiaru Medea, Eliza's disappearance." Mr. Cole nodded, his moustache quivering. "That's serious talk, Miss Marple. We need to search that house. Will you come with me?" She agreed, and they headed to the Miller house, the key heavy in her handbag. The garden was wild, the gate creaking as they entered. Inside, the air was thick with dust, the silence heavy. They climbed to the attic, where Mr. Cole examined, the lantern and blankets, his face grim. "Someone's been here," he said, pointing to the handprint. "Not long ago." They searched further, and Miss Marple noticed a new clue. A small dusty book tucked behind a rafter, its cover worn. It was a ledger, listing payments to E.B., large sums marked as loans. Her heart quickened. Eliza had given Barlow money, likely her savings, explaining her fear in the letters. They moved downstairs, and Mr. Cole found a loose floorboard in the kitchen, revealing a hidden trapdoor. "What's this?" he muttered, pulling it open. A narrow staircase led to a cellar, dark and damp. Miss Marple's breath caught as they descended, the constable's lantern casting shadows. At the far end, beneath a tarp, lay a bundle of cloth, stained and heavy. Mr. Cole lifted it, revealing bones, human bones wrapped carefully, as if in respect. "Eliza!" Miss Marple whispered, her heart sinking. The constable's face was pale, his hands steady, but his eyes shaken. "We need to get the coroner," he said, "and find this Barlow." Back at the office, Mr. Cole sent a telegram to London, requesting a trace on Edward Barlow. Miss Marple shared her theory. Barlow, a charming con man, had won Eliza's love and money, promising a new life. When she pressed him to repay the debt, he came to Willoughby, and in a heated argument killed her, hiding her body in the cellar. The attic's traces suggested he'd returned, perhaps to retrieve something, haunted by his crime. That afternoon, Miss Marple visited Lydia Crane, hoping to understand her role. Lydia opened the door, her face drawn, her eyes red. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice flat. "What now?" "I know about the trail," Miss Marple said gently. "The burned sketch, the paintbrush. You loved Eliza, didn't you?" Lydia's shoulders slumped, tears falling. "She was my friend," she whispered. "I saw her with him, Barlow, a slick city man. She was happy but scared. After she vanished, I painted her, trying to keep her alive. I saw him sneaking around last week by the house. I burned some sketches, afraid he'd come for me." She sobbed, and Miss Marple patted her hand, her heart heavy. At the Hargreaves' cottage, Miss Marple spoke to Margaret and Thomas. "Eliza's been found?" she said softly. Margaret gasped, her hands shaking, while Thomas's face fell. "The debt," he admitted, his voice low. "She owed me for ale, but I didn't hurt her. I argued, sure, but that was all." Margaret nodded, her eyes wet, and Miss Marple believed them. Their fear was guilt, not murder. Dr. Warren visited Clara's that evening, his face weary. "I heard," he said. "I knew Eliza was scared, but I didn't push." "I failed her," Miss Marple reassured him, seeing his regret was genuine. a telegram arrived from London. Barlow, a known fraudster, was arrested, confessing to Eliza's accidental death during a fight over money. He'd hidden her body, returning recently to retrieve the ledger, fearing exposure. The case was closed, and Sycamore Street began to heal. Lydia burned her last sketches, finding peace in truth. The Hargreaves reconciled, their secrets aired. Felix vowed to be more vigilant. As Miss Marple packed her knitting, Clara smiled. "You broke the silence, Jane." "Silence speaks if you listen," Miss Marple said, her eyes twinkling. On the train back to St. Mary Mead, she gazed out the window, the village fading behind her. Sycamore Street was quiet again, but now it was a peaceful quiet, its secrets laid bare.